Pennsylvania, this ASMR horror story whispers of haunted woods, missing hikers, and a curse that lingers in every rustle of leaves. Perfect for ASMR scary stories, ASMR ghost story, and ASMR creepy story lovers. You're listening to ASMR 404Found. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. I still remember the way the Hollow Pines Trailhead looked that morning when I pulled into the small gravel lot that sat on the edge of the Bitterroot Mountains in Idaho. The air was sharp and cool with that clean alpine bite that makes you feel like your lungs are drinking ice water, and there was the scent of pine so strong it felt like you could taste the resin in the back of your throat. The sky was that washed out early gray, where the sun hasn't decided if it wants to show itself. Yet in the shadows under the trees stretched long and still across the ground, like something was lying in wait deep in those woods. He had been invited out here by my old college friend Mason, who had recently taken up a seasonal ranger job in the area. He had called me a week earlier, his voice a little too quick, a little too tight, telling me that there were stories about this trail that the locals didn't talk about openly, and he wanted someone he trusted to come see it with him, not because it was dangerous, at least that's what he said at first, but because it was strange in ways he couldn't explain. The Hollow Pines Trail itself was not marked on most tourist maps. The wooden sign at the entrance was weathered so badly that the carved letters were almost unreadable except for a faint H and P. And the paint that had once filled them was peeling away like old scabs. Board was nailed to two thick posts, but one was leaning just enough to make the whole sign tilt slightly to the right, giving the entrance a lopsided, almost uneasy look, the kind that makes you second guess. May you want to walk under it. Mason was already leaning against his truck when I arrived, his ranger uniform dusty, his ball cap pulled low over his brow, and in his hand a thermos that steamed in the chill. He didn't wave when I got out. He just nodded slow and said something like, "You made good time," then turned to look at the trail again like he hadn't really expected me to show up. Told me as we started walking that this trail was older than the Forest Service itself, that before the area was ever protected land, there were homesteads scattered through these woods and logging camps deeper in the mountains. Most of those families had vanished by the early 1900s, either moved on or just gone without a word. The few records left talked about harsh winters, wild animal attacks, and sickness. But Mason had heard from some of the older locals that those were just the stories they told strangers. The real stories, they whispered, were about lights in the trees, voices calling from the dark, and paths that never led where you thought they would. The trail was narrow at first, weaving between tall lodgepole pines, whose trunks rose like columns into the dim canopy. The needles whispered in the breeze, but every so often there was a pause in that sound, a strange thick silence, like the trees were holding their breath. I tried to brush it off as my imagination, but even the dirt underfoot seemed wrong. It was soft in places, but in others it had a strange spring to it, like there was something hollow beneath, and when I glanced down I thought I saw gaps between roots that were too deep, too dark to be just shadows. Mason kept talking quietly, pointing out old markings on the trees, not modern blazes, but faint cuts in the bark, Sometimes to parallel slashes, sometimes a crude X. He said they matched no forestry pattern he knew of, and the strangest thing was they seemed fresher than they should have been for how old the wood around them looked. I reached out to touch one and felt a faint warmth in the groove, like the cut had been made recently, even though the sap had already hardened over it about a mile, and we came to an old wooden bridge that crossed a narrow creek. The water was slow and black, reflecting the pines like a sheet of obsidian. The boards of the bridge were slick with moss, and some gave under our weight as we crossed. Mason told me that this was where he had first felt the pull that made him uneasy about the trail. He said the first time he crossed it, he heard something moving in the water just under the surface, keeping pace with him step for step. He hadn't seen anything then, but 2 days later when he came back, he found wet handprints on the railingas. We reached the other side. I noticed the air felt heavier, almost damp. The smell of pine was sharper, but mixed now with something faintly sweet and rotten like fruit. Left out in the sun too long, Mason slowed his pace, scanning the trees on either side of the trail. I could hear the crunch of our boots on the dirt louder now, like the sound was pushing back against the silence. And then from somewhere deep in the woods to our left, there came a sound that didn't belong, a low drawn-out creak like a door hinge, but stretched longer than any hinge could move, followed by the faintest sound of something dragging through leaves. We both froze. Mason's eyes darting to mine, his hand moving instinctively to the flashlight on his belt. He didn't turn it on, just held it there like he needed the weight of it in his hand. The sound came again, slower, softer, then nothing but the stillness of the trees and the faint rush of blood in my ears. So kept walking, Mason in front. Now his posture tight. The trail began to climb, twisting around a ridge where the trees grew denser, the light dimming as if we were walking into evening, even though it was still morning. The wind shifted, carrying with it a faint murmuring like someone speaking far away, but the words were impossible to make out. Each time I thought I caught a phrase, it was gone, replaced by something else entirely. When we rounded the bend at the top of the ridge, I saw what had made Mason call me here, and my stomach nodded. There was an opening in the trees ahead, not wide enough to be called a clearing, but different enough that the light shifted in a strange way, as if the sun was being bent around something. I could not see the air in that space, looked thicker like heat haze, but the temperature here was cold enough for my breath to still drift in pale ribbons. Mason stopped just short of stepping into it, and I could see the tension in his shoulders, as if he was bracing for something to come rushing out. The ground here was different, to no more roots or loose soil. Instead, it was a carpet of pine needles, so thick they swallowed the sound of our steps, each one dry and brittle, yet somehow holding a faint glisten like they had been coated in something. Color beneath them was wrong, not the brown and gold you'd expect, but a dark reddish hue that made me think of rusted iron or dried blood. Mason crouched down, pushing aside a handful of needles, and I saw what lay underneath. Thin bones, no bigger than a finger, dozens, maybe hundreds of them, packed together in the soil. Like a pale underlayer, let the needles fall back over them as if covering something that should never have been uncovered, and we both stepped back without saying a word, but I could tell by the way his eyes were fixed on the opposite side of the opening that he had not brought me here for the bones alone. There was something else across the space directly facing us stood what I first thought was a dead tree, its bark pale and flaking, its branches stripped bare. But then I noticed the unnatural symmetry of its shape, and the way the trunk was thicker at the top, tapering down like a crude totem. The surface of it was carved all over with deep grooves, each one curling and twisting into patterns that made my eyes ache to follow. The design were not letters and not quite symbols either, but they had the weight of meaning, like they belonged to something far older than any language I knew. Mason whispered that the first time he had found this place the carvings had not been here. That had been less than 3 weeks ago. His voice was so low I almost missed what he said next. That sometimes at night when he was off duty he would hear knocking out in the woods, slow and deliberate, like someone rapping their knuckles against wood. And when he came back to check the next day, new carvings would be on the totemi. Felt something watching us from behind it, the way you feel eyes on your back in a crowd, and I realized that the haze I had seen earlier was not a trick of light, but a faint shiver in the air itself, like heat rising from asphalt, except it was rolling outward from the totem and curling around the trees in slow, twisting waves. The hairs on my arms lifted, and the sound of the forest seemed to pull back, like we were standing inside a bubble of quiet. Then it happened, a ripple passed through the haze, and I heard a voice from somewhere deep within it. It was not loud, but it was clear, a low drawling tone that stretched each word until it almost lost its shape. It called Mason's name, then mine, the way you might call to someone across a field. Except the cadence was wrong. It rose where it should have fallen, and each time it said my name, it lingered on the last sound like it was tasting it. Mason grabbed my arm hard enough to make me flinch and started pulling me backward away from the hazy. As soon as my boot crossed back over into the shaded part of the trail, the air felt lighter again, but I could still hear the voice behind us, calling slower, now softer, but still carrying my name. Mason didn't let go of my arm until we had put several yards between ourselves and that opening end. When he finally spoke, he said that no one ever came out here twice, not the locals, not the hunters, not even the loggers back when the camps were running. And now I understood. I had kept moving deeper into the trail because Mason said turning back too soon was worse than going forward. The path narrowed again, the pines growing so close together their trunks almost touched the light here, the stem green filtering down through the needles and shifting patterns that made it hard to tell if the shadows on the ground were moving because of the wind or something else entirely. More than once I thought I saw shapes flitting between the trunks just ahead of us, but each time I looked straight at them they were gone, leaving only the faint swaying of the branches. For another half-mile the sound of water returned, faint at first, then clearer. The trail opened onto another bridge, this one much older than the first. The boards blackened and warped, the railings half gone. The creek below was wider here, moving sluggishly under a film of pale scum. Mason stopped at the edge and told me that the last time he had crossed this bridge, he had seen a figure standing in the middle of it, bent over like it was looking at something in the water. But when he called out, the figure straightened and turned, and its face had been wrong. Asked him what he meant by wrong, and he said it was not a face at all. Not in the way we understand it. The features were there, but they seemed to slide against each other like they weren't fixed in place, the eyes moving slower than the mouth opening in a different rhythm than the jaw. The longer he looked, the more the parts seemed to rearrange themselves into something new and worse. When it stepped toward him, the boards under its feet didn't make a sound. Stepped onto the bridge together, the wood groaning under our weight, and as we reached the middle, I caught movement in the water below, something pale and long winding. Slowly against the current, Mason gripped the railing, his eyes fixed on the shape, and for a moment, I thought it was a log or a tangle of roots, but then it bent at an angle no wood could bend. I saw fingers breaking the surface, dragging slowly along the underside of the bridge. The fingers that slid along the underside of the bridge were grayish-white with skin so thin it looked like wet paper stretched over bone, the nails long and ridged and curling at the ends. Like they had been growing for decades, the knuckles bulged as they flexed and curled, dragging themselves slowly closer to where we stood. Mason's breathing grew sharp. I could feel his tension like static in the air. He whispered for me not to look directly at them, to keep my gaze on the far side, the bridge, and walk steady, but the sound of those nails scraping wood was like a hook in my ear, pulling my eyes down. When I finally looked, I saw more than one hand sliding in and out of the shadow beneath us, moving in a slow, deliberate rhythm. Each hand thin and too long, each nail leaving faint grooves in the boards above them. The hill shape in the water twisted again, and I realized it was not a body lying under the bridge, but something longer, something that didn't have to surface to breathe, and the hands were only the parts it chose to show us. Mason muttered, "Keep walking. Just keep walking," and we did, our steps in sync until we reached the other side. Without breaking pace, though, I could swear I felt one of those nails catch briefly on the heel of my boot. As I stepped off the last boardings, we were back on solid ground. I noticed the trail here had changed again. The trees were older, thicker, their bark rough, and split, the branches twisting overhead like they were reaching for each other. The air was colder and smelled faintly of smoke, though there was no sign of fire. Mason said we were approaching the section the locals called the listening stretch. Not because you could hear things here, but because here the woods listen to you. He warned me not to speak above a whisper and not to say anything I didn't want repeated back to me later in the night. As we moved on, I began to understand. But he meant the wind in the trees was soft, but it carried a strange echo, like our footsteps and breathing were being played back to us half a beat late once or twice. I thought I heard my own voice whispering something low and urgent just ahead, but the words were not anything I had said. Mason told me that the last person he brought here left in the middle of the night to towns over. Hearing their own voice call them outside 3 times in a row. The ground here was littered with old fallen branches. I noticed that many of them were arranged in odd ways, sometimes leaning together to form crude arches, sometimes laying in perfect parallel lines. Mason swore no one made these on purpose. Yet every time the Forest Service cleared them, they reappeared within a week, often in more elaborate patterns. He said that one winter they found a full circle of branches, interwoven together with strips of hide and teeth threaded along the edge. After about half a mile of this, the trail widened slightly, and we came upon an old bench set just Off to the right it was weathered and gray, the wood soft from years of rot, but what struck me was the carving along the backrest, dozens of names etched deep into the grain, the letters uneven, and overlapping, some of them fresh enough that flakes of pale wood still clung to the grooves. Mason ran his hand over one and said none of these names belonged to anyone local, and most of them matched no missing person reports he could find. But every time a new name appears, it's as if the bench has aged a little more, like the wood itself is feeding on them. We didn't sit, we just passed by, and the bench seemed to loom behind us in my peripheral vision like it was waiting for us to stop. Mason kept glancing over his shoulder until the trail curved enough to hide it from view, and then he seemed to relax just a little. Though his voice stayed low and careful, came to another rise in the trail, and from the top, I could see the land dipping into a shallow valley below the pines there, even denser than before, their trunks so close together the shadows were almost solid. At the bottom of the slope was a narrow stretch of boardwalk crossing what looked like a bog. The water on either side was a sickly green, choked with moss and strange floating mats of vegetation. The smell was strong enough to make my stomach clench. Mix of rot and something sweet that made my teeth ache, Mason said. This was where most hikers turned around, even if they had made it this far, because sometimes when you stepped onto that boardwalk, you would hear footsteps following behind you. But they never matched your pace, and if you turned to look, nothing would be there. Just the board swaying slightly as if someone had just stepped off. Started down the slope, the air growing damp and heavy, the sound of insects faint. But constant. Mason kept his eyes on the ground, his jaw tight. I could feel the mud sucking at my boots before we even reached the first board, and the wood underfoot felt swollen and slick with moisture. The bog on either side gurgled faintly, as if breathing something just beneath the surface. I stepped carefully, but halfway across, I felt the board dip sharply behind me as though a heavy weight had been set on it. I turned my head slowly and saw no one, but the far end of the board I had just crossed was pressed lower into the water, and the ripple spreading out from it was too large for any fish. Mason's whisper reached me, sharp and urgent. Don't stop, keep going, keep your eyes forward. I kept moving across the boardwalk, each step a careful press against the slick wood. My eyes locked on the far end where the trail picked up again, but the sensation of weight following me did not let up. It shifted from one board to the next in a slow, measured rhythm, as if whoever or whatever was behind me knew exactly how to match the creak. Without rushing, I tried to breathe evenly, but my chest felt tight, the sweet rot of the bog filling my lungs. Mason stayed a step ahead, glancing over his shoulder once and shaking his head before looking forward again. The message clear: don't look back. About 3/4 across the bog, the boards narrowed and dipped lower into the water, the green mats of plant life brushing against my boots. Something moved beneath them, a shadow gliding under the surface, its shape stretching, curling like it had too many joints. I could feel the vibration through the soles of my feet, a faint pulse in the wood as if something was pressing upward from below. I lengthened my stride, wanting nothing more than to be off that walkway on solid ground again. When we finally stepped onto dirt, the air shifted abruptly, the sweetness fading into a colder, sharper scent like wet stone, and Metal-Eye turned to glance back at the boardwalk and froze. The end we had just stepped from was empty, yet the last 3 boards were still sinking slowly into the water, one after the other in perfect rhythm, leaving behind faint dark stains that spread outward on the surface. Mason muttered, "Keep moving," under his breath. I didn't argue. The trail rose again, leading us into an area where the pines leaned so far over the path their tops touched, creating a tunnel of dark green. The ground here was hard and uneven, scattered with rocks, slick with moss. Every sound we made was swallowed by the canopy, and my own breathing seemed too loud in the stillness. Mason said this part was called the bend because no matter how far you walked, you could never see more than 20 or 30 feet ahead. The trail was always curving slightly to the right, as if leading you in circles. He claimed he had once walked for over an hour without reaching the next landmark, only to find he was less than half a mile from where he started. As we walked, I noticed something unsettling. The trees on the inside of the curve all had deep scars in their bark, long vertical gashes, as if something with enormous claws had raked them one after another. The sap that oozed from them was black instead of amber, thick and slow like tar. Mason said he had tested it once and found it was not tree resin at all, but some kind of organic fluid that defied identification. The lab report had called it an anomaly and recommended disposal of the sample. Further we went, the more the air seemed to hum, a faint vibration that I could feel in my jaw and teeth. I told Mason and he nodded, saying that sometimes the hum got so loud people would start to hear words hidden in it, whispers layered beneath the vibration, like a voice speaking from inside your bones. I tried to focus on my steps, but sure enough the hum began to take shape, forming syllables so faint I could barely catch them. It sounded like my name again, only drawn out and broken into pieces surrounded a sharper bend. Found ourselves staring at a massive fallen tree blocking the trail. Its trunk was wide enough to park a car on, and the roots reared up beside it like a wall, tangled with soil and stone. But the most disturbing part was the shape embedded in those roots. At first I thought it was a human figure wrapped in old burlap, its form twisted at an unnatural angle, the fabric clinging to sharp angles of bone. But then I realized it was not fabric at all, but some kind of bark-like growth fused to the shape, sealing it in place. Mason whispered that the first time he saw it, the figure had been facing the other direction, and he avoided looking too closely at its head. Had to climb over the trunk to continue, and as I placed my hands on the mossy surface, I felt a faint tremor pass through it, like something deep inside the wood was shifting. I scrambled over faster than I intended and landed hard on the other side. Mason followed quickly, glancing back only once before urging me forward, his voice lower than before. Beyond the fallen tree, the trail began to descend again, but the air here was warmer and damp, and I could hear faint dripping sounds, as though water was seeping from the trunks themselves. The pines thinned just enough to reveal patches of open ground where the soil was unnaturally dark and soft. Mason avoided stepping on these patches entirely, and when I asked why, he said some them were sinkholes, though they didn't always lead where you'd expect. He had once watched a branch dropped into one vanish without a sound and never strike bottom. We're nearing what Mason called the hollow center, a place most people never reached and fewer returned from. He said once you were inside it, the forest didn't just watch you, it learned you. The trail dipped into a low basin surrounded on all sides by towering pines, whose trunks were blackened at the base as if fire had licked them. But never climbed higher than a few feet. The air here was still almost heavy, and the sound of the forest had gone flat as though every leaf and needle had stopped moving. Mason slowed his pace, telling me that this was the hollow center and that from this point forward the trail didn't always lead where you thought it would. He said it was easy to walk for an hour and find yourself back at the same spot from a different direction without ever realizing you had turned it. In the center of the basin was a small clearing where the dirt had been worn smooth in a wide circle as if countless feet had walked it over the years, yet no footprints remained. The ground was hard-packed but not dry. There was a faint give to it under my boots, like something soft lay just beneath. Mason pointed toward the far side where a narrow side path led away from the main trail and said that no one should ever take it because it didn't lead anywhere you could come back from. He had only seen one person go that way, and they had not returned, though weeks later their voice was heard calling out from different parts of the forest. At night there seemed to press closer as we crossed the clearing. My ears felt full like I was deep underwater, and a faint high tone rang just at the edge of hearing. I noticed shapes carved into the trunks around the circle, not the curling patterns from before, but crude figures, some human, some animal, some impossible. Their lines etched deep into the wood and filled with something that shimmered faintly in the dim light. Mason refused to touch them, and when I reached out, the air around my hand felt colder. On the far side of the basin, the trail narrowed into a passage between two massive boulders. The surface is slick with moss, but marked here and there with deep grooves like claw marks. The space between them was barely wide enough to walk through, and the moment I stepped inside, I felt the temperature drop even further. The smell of pine gave way to something metallic and faintly sour. Mason moved quickly through without looking at the walls, but I couldn't help glancing to my left where the moss was thin, and the stone beneath seemed to ripple in the light like water. When we emerged on the other side, the forest looked different. The trunks were pale, almost white, the branches thin and brittle, the needles sparse, letting more light through, yet the light here felt wrong. It was too sharp, casting shadows that bent away from their sources. The trail ahead was lined with stones, each one marked with a single vertical line carved deep and clean. Mason said the stones had been there for as long as anyone could remember, but every few weeks their positions changed slightly as if being moved by unseen hands. Followed the path between them and soon came to a fork. One path continued forward, the other curved sharply left. Mason didn't hesitate. He took the left without a glance at the other. I asked why, and he said that straight ahead was the echo stretch. If you heard something behind you, it would not be an echo at all, and if you turned to look, it would already be closer than you could react. His voice was so steady when he said it that I didn't ask again. The left path wound through more pale pines, their bark flaking away in thin sheets that curled at the edges like peeling skin. Here the ground was littered with fragments of wood, so then they crumbled underfoot with a faint papery crackle. I began to notice faint depressions in the dirt on either side of the path. Mason avoided stepping near them, his jaw tight after. Another 100 yards, we came to a fallen shelter half buried in the dirt. It looked like it had once been a hunting shack. The roof collapsed, the walls rotting away. Yet there was something about the way it leaned that made it feel deliberate, as if it had been placed here rather than abandoned. Mason pointed to the doorway where strips of animal hide still hung in tatters, the edges chewed and frayed, and told me that, no matter how many times they were removed, they always came back the same within days inside the shack. The air was warmer and still the floor was covered in a thick mat of pine needles, yet I could see faint shapes beneath them, long and straight like beams or bones. I didn't step inside. Mason only stood in the doorway looking toward the dark far corner, where the shadows seemed to deepen unnaturally. He said he had once seen something move there, a slow, deliberate shift, like someone crawling on their hands and knees, but larger than any person could be. We backed away together, neither of us taking our eyes from that corner until the shack was out of sight. Banded, the trail began to climb again, the pale pines giving way to darker, thicker trees, their bark rougher, their scent stronger. The ground here was uneven, scattered with rocks, covered in lichen and patches of black moss. Mason said we were close to the ridge line and that the view from the top was worth it if you could stand what else came with it. The climb was steep enough that my breath came heavier and the air grew thinner. The pines here were twisted, their trunks bending at sharp angles as if they had grown, while trying to avoid something above them. Patches of bare rock jutted from the soil, slick with moisture, though no rain had fallen. The smell of wet stone mixed with pine resin made the back of my throat ache. Mason moved with a steady pace, but I could tell by the way his eyes kept scanning the tree line that he was listening for something. Halfway up the ridge, we passed a section where the ground to our right dropped away into a narrow ravine, the bottom lost in shadow. The walls were streaked with dark stains, and here and there I could see bones caught in the roots, jutting from the earth, some small like they belonged to animals, others long enough to make my chest tighten. Mason said the ravine had no official name, but some of the older locals called it the Carry because things that went down there never stayed where they fell. He claimed once during a storm he saw a deer carcass pulled slowly along the bottom as if by a current, though there was no water there at Alice. We climbed higher. The wind picked up, carrying with it a faint whistling sound. At first I thought it was just the air moving through the branches, but the tone shifted, rising and falling in a way that felt intentional. Mason slowed, listening, his brow furrowed. He whispered that sometimes the wind here was not wind at all, but something moving along the ridge, keeping pace with those who climbed. He had never seen it, but he had heard it many times, and once after reaching the top he found tracks in the rock itself, long grooves that had not been there before. The final stretch to the ridge was a narrow path between two walls of jagged stone, the space just wide enough for one person to pass at a time. The rock was cold to the touch and damp with condensation. As I moved through, I could hear faint tapping from somewhere inside it, like knuckles rapping on hollow wood. The sound followed me the entire way, growing softer only when I stepped out onto the ridge. A view from the top was wide and strange. The forest below stretched for miles, but there were pockets of mist in places where no water ran, and gaps in the tree line that that formed shapes too precise to be natural. From here I could see the pale clearing. We had passed ours earlier, but it looked farther away. Then it should have. Mason stood beside me, pointing out landmarks, yet his voice was distracted. He kept glancing toward the far end of the ridge, where a lone tree stood taller than the rest, its bark black and cracked, its branches bare, and reaching upward like skeletal arms. Said that tree had been there longer than any record of the trail, and no matter the season, it never grew leaves nor fell to storms. He claimed that once you walked to it and touched the trunk, you would begin to hear knocking wherever you went, sometimes faint, sometimes so loud it shook the walls around you. He had touched it once years ago without knowing the stories, and to this day he still woke at night to the sound of slow, deliberate knocks from somewhere just beyond his door. Didn't go to the tree instead. We followed the ridge as it curved back into the forest. The path here was rough, littered with stones that shifted underfoot. The trees grew closer again, but they were shorter, and their bark was scarred with circular marks about the size of a hand. Mason said these were never on the same trees twice. They appeared overnight and vanished just as suddenly. No one knew what made them, but they always came in threes, and he had learned not to stand between trees that both bore them. The ridge began to slope downward, and the forest thickened until the sky was little more than a dim green glow overhead. The air here was warmer and carried the faint scent of something burning. There was no smoke. I noticed the ground was covered with small mounds of earth, some no bigger than a fist, others large enough to trip over. Mason stepped carefully, avoiding each one, and told me they were breathing mounds, the soil sometimes shifting, as if something underneath was moving slowly upward. He said that if a mound ever broke open, what came out would not go back. And as we moved between them, the air grew more oppressive, heavy in my lungs. The path ahead was darker than it should have been, as if the light had been drained from it entirely. Mason said we were nearing the listening split where the trail divided into two narrow corridors, each lined with trunks so close together you had to turn sideways to pass through. He said no matter which you took, you would hear footsteps behind you, matching your pace exactly until you reached the end. But if you stopped, they would not have reached the split, and Mason took the left without hesitation. I followed the wood of the trunks scraping against my shoulders, the air thick with the smell of damp bark and something sour. The sound of my own steps was loud in the narrow space, and sure enough there was another set behind me in perfect time with mine. I glanced at Mason, but he kept his eyes forward, his expression set when I stopped. For half a second the steps behind me stopped too, but the space felt suddenly smaller, as if something was pressing in from behind. So I started walking again without looking back. The air in Ashpine Hollow had shifted to something heavier than before, and the damp smell of rotting pine needles was now mixed with the metallic scent of something I could not quite place, and the further I walked, the more that smell seemed to cling to my throat, making it hard to swallow and harder to breathe. My flashlight beam felt weaker, as if the forest was swallowing it whole with every passing step. And then I heard it again, that long dragging sound, like something heavy was being pulled across wet soil, coming from somewhere deep ahead on the trail. My body wanted to turn around, yet my legs kept moving on their own as though something unseen had its fingers hooked into my shoulders, guiding me forward with slow, deliberate tugs, and when I reached the bend, I saw the faintest flicker of lantern light, weaving between the black tree trunks as if someone was walking slowly just out of reach. When I called out, the light stopped and the dragging sound went silent too, and all I could hear was my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Should have turned back right then, but the silence pulled me in even more. My boots sank into the soft moss with every step muffling my movement until I stood at the spot where the lantern glow had been only moments before. And there was nothing there, no light, no footprints, no sign of life, except for the faint ripple of shadows that seemed to move, even though the trees stood still. And then the dragging sound began again, but this time it was behind me and it was faster, heavier, scraping across the earth with a rhythm like breathing, and I spun around, lifting my light, and for a split second, I saw something pale sliding just beyond the reach of the beam. Something too low to be a person, too big to be an animal, its body bent at impossible angles. Before it darted behind a cluster of ferns with a wet rustle that made my stomach twist. I told myself it must be a trick of my mind, maybe just the branches moving in the wind, but there was no wind. The air was still and pressing, and I could hear tiny snapping sounds, like twigs breaking under something's weight, slowly circling me from the dark. I realized then that whatever was out here had been leading me the whole time, luring me deeper into Ashpine Hollow, where the trees grew so close together the sky disappeared above and the trail beneath my feet seemed less like dirt and more like something breathing shallow and slow, as if the ground itself was alive. I kept my light steady, but it felt like it was being swallowed inch by the dark, and my own breathing grew shallow because every sound in the forest was now in rhythm with mine. I could swear that something in the shadows was matching my inhale and exhale, as if mocking me or sensing with me, like it was waiting for the right moment to close in. I stepped backward carefully, trying to retrace my path, but the trail looked different now. The roots were twisted into new patterns. The moss seemed to pulse faintly under my boots, and the trees felt taller, older, leaning in just enough to make the path seem narrower. I caught a glimmer on the ground ahead, a thin strip of metal, half buried in the soil, and when I brushed away the damp earth, I saw it was an old hunting knife rested along the blade. The handle slick with something that made my fingers sting. He dropped it right away, because the sting spread across my palm like pins and needles crawling under my skin, and I wiped my hand on my jeans, but the feeling stayed and worsened. And that was when I heard voices, faint ones overlapping like a crowd murmuring behind a closed door. Except I was standing alone in the woods and the nearest town was miles away, and the whispers were coming from every direction, weaving through the trees just soft enough that I could not make out a single word, but sharp enough to keep me frozen in place. Everything moved ahead of me again, low and fluid, and I caught the shine of eyes reflecting my light, but they were too far apart to high off the ground for any animal I knew, and they did not blink. They just stayed locked on me until the dragging sound returned, this time not behind or ahead, but circling tighter and tighter like a noose drawing in, and the soil under me felt spongy, as if I were standing on soaked fabric, and I realized my boots were slowly sinking No matter how I shifted my weight, the ground held on like it had fingers of its own. Whispers grew louder until they were almost a chant, and my light flickered once, twice, then went dark, leaving me in nothing but the thick smell of rot and the weight of something breathing inches from my ear. And in that moment I knew whatever had been leading me here had finally caught up, and there was no clear way out. I could not move at first because the air itself felt too heavy to push through. Like every breath was sinking deeper into me, and the darkness pressed against my skin like damp cloth, and I could hear that breath again, so close to my ear that it tickled the fine hairs on my neck. And I turned quick, but there was nothing there, only the faintest outline of tree trunks spinning like ribs and a chest holding me inside. And the ground beneath me let out a slow wet groan as if the earth was stretching. I realized the trail was gone, completely replaced by a narrow corridor of black water leading deeper into the trees. He stepped back and my boots splashed into the water, ice cold. That shot straight through my bones, and something brushed against my ankle, slick and deliberate, and I yanked my leg up, stumbling to the side. But the water followed like it was alive, pulling around my feet even on higher ground. My hand stung again, the same spot that had touched the knife earlier, and I could feel the pattern of the handle burning itself into my skin. A pale light flickered deeper in the woods. Not the glow of a flashlight, but something more natural and wrong at the same time, like moonlight bending where it should not reach, and I felt pulled toward it, not by sight alone, but by a low hum that settled right in the center of my skull, making it impossible to think about anything else. And as I stepped forward, the whispers changed their tone. They were not calling from all around anymore. They were directly ahead, guiding me to that light with a rhythm like a heartbeat. I could see movement now, shapes in the light like figures pacing around each other, and every now and then one would stop and turn its head in my direction, though it was too far to see a face. But I could feel their eyes like warm pressure against my skin, and the hum grew louder until it felt like my thoughts were vibrating. I wanted to shout just to break the sound, but my voice would not cometh. Trees opened up to a clearing I had never seen before, even on maps, and in the center stood something that was not built by hands. It was a ring of stone covered in carvings that pulsed faintly, as if lit from within, and each pulse seemed to drag the air closer to the center, pulling me with it, and the figures moved between the stones in a slow dance, swaying in time with the light and the hum, and every instinct in me screamed to turn back, but the ground behind me had shifted again, closing in with the same black water that now carried faint ripples toward me. I could feel the pull stronger now, like an invisible rope had looped around my ribs and was tightening with each pulse from the stones, dragging me toward the center of the clearing. The figures moved in that same slow rhythm, and as I stepped closer, I saw their faces for the first time, pale as candle wax, with eyes too wide, mouths slightly open as if caught in a silent gasp, and their skin shimmered in the dim light like water reflecting fire. And I realized I had seen those faces before on the missing posters pinned to the trailhead board. Their movements were not random. Each step and sway matched the beat of the hum, which had shifted into a low chant now spoken in a language I could not understand, but somehow felt like I had always known, and it filled the inside of my chest with a heat that was not mine. I wanted to resist, but my body kept moving forward, drawn into the circle, until I stood right at the ring of stones. Inside the ring, the ground was not dirt. It was a perfect black mirror reflecting the trees above, though the reflection moved out of sync. But the real branches swaying slower, and when I leaned just enough to look deeper, I saw shapes. Beneath the surface, not water, but something thicker, holding on to whatever had sunk there, and in that reflection I saw myself, only it was not me, because its eyes were empty and its mouth kept moving in time. But the chanton of the figures reached out to me, their hand ice cold and their nails long, enough to press little crescents into my wrist, and they began to guide me over the stones. Their grip stronger than bone, and the hum inside my head became the only sound. I could hear drowning out the wind, the trees, the very beat of my heart, and when my foot touched that black mirror, it did not ripple, it opened and the cold rushed through me, as if every drop of blood in my body had been replaced by something older and heavier. My vision swam and twisted until the faces around me blurred into streaks of light and shadow, and I felt myself falling not down but inward into a place that had no air, no sky, no end, and in the very last flicker of the clearing above, I saw my own face, watching me go, mouth still moving to the rhythm that would never stop.